what if the very idea of ethnicity isn't really about, you know, fixed groups you're just born into?
Hmm.
But maybe it's more like a profound, often unconscious human fantasy.
That's a really provocative way to start.
Yeah, what if it's kind of an illusion, something civilization cooked up, but still has this huge real-world power?
It definitely makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We usually see ethnicity as just
Yeah.
there, static,
Yeah.
but maybe it's way more fluid, more psychologically tangled than we realize.
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we're getting into Michael Moskowitz's paper, Ethnicity and the Fantasy of Ethnicity. And we're going to unpack his pretty bold argument that ethnicity, how we normally think about it, is actually this complex psychological thing, not just biology or some unchanging culture.
Right.
Our mission here is to look at its surprising links to psychoanalysis, its huge impact on identity, on oppression, and, ultimately challenge this whole idea of fixed ethnic lines.
So, yeah, get ready to maybe stretch your understanding of identity a bit. Some assumptions might get shaken up. We'll walk through three main ideas from the paper. First, this kind of hidden multicultural story behind psychoanalysis itself.
Okay.
Second, the sheer reality and trauma of Blackness as a lived experience.
Right.
And finally, Moskowitz's biggest claim, the really provocative one,
Yeah.
that deep down, there is no ethnicity, at least not in the way we usually mean it.
Okay, let's start unpacking that. Moskowitz begins with a personal story, actually.
right.
He mentions leaving a conference, picking up his young son from camp. And he and his wife felt this, quiet anxiety about the separation, trying not to show it. But their son seemed fine, and they joked about how those classic stiff upper lip British parents might have just, cheerfully sent their kids off to war or whatever for Queen and Empire.
That image, the unfeeling culture, it's quite a starting point.
It is.
And another researcher, Stone, actually identified 4 factors that might have fed into that kind of psychic numbing in British culture back then.
Like what?
Things like maybe not having one consistent mother figure early on, constant loss from early deaths, even physically restraining babies tightly, and deliberately breaking a child's will with punishment.
Wow.
And the result, Stone argued, was adults who often showed this sort of calculating indifference, or even suspicion, hostility, maybe rage.
It's wild to think that those traits, which sound pretty negative to us now, were once seen as valuable, right? For building the British Empire, making it adaptive, productive.
Exactly. And it's only more recently that people have really started acknowledging the huge downside of oppression and exploitation baked into that whole system. But what's interesting is how British values did start to change. And figures like Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, were a big part of that shift.
Okay, Winnicott.
Yeah, he was British, a product of that culture. But his insights weren't purely homegrown. He was really influenced by people like Freud, an Austrian Jew, and even more by Melanie Klein, who's a Hungarian Jew.
Ah, so that's the connection.
Right. This mix of cultures gets to Moskowitz's first point. Psychoanalysis, from the very beginning, was actually a deeply multicultural thing.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't just about, say, European versus non-European, but a mix within Europe itself.
Precisely. And anthropologists like Wolff point out that places like Europe, Africa, Asia, they've been trading and mixing cultures for centuries. Even the slave trade was, for a time, colorblind.
Right.
So Vienna, where Freud worked, was a major hub. It soaked up influences from all over for generations. These centers of culture were often real melting pots.
And Freud's Vienna specifically.
Oh, definitely a melting pot. Capital of this huge empire, super cosmopolitan, and importantly, the most Jewish city in Europe at the time.
Really?
Yeah, 1910 figures show a big chunk of the population, university students, journalists, were Jewish. But here's the paradox. Vienna was also where both Zionism and modern anti-Semitism really took root.
Wow. Okay. And Freud himself, his own identity.
Well, the paper stresses that Freud, no matter how assimilated he might have seemed, always saw himself as a Jew. He felt it put him in opposition to mainstream culture, and he actually found that inspiring.
Inspiring? How so?
He wrote something like, to believe in this new theory, psychoanalysis, you needed to be ready for solitary opposition, and no one knows that better than a Jew. He even said, as a Jew, I was prepared to join the opposition.
So he embraced that outsider status in a way.
It seems so. Now, contrast that with American psychoanalysis later on. There's this critique that one school, ego psychology, became really dominant, but also kind of restrictive.
Restrictive how?
Well, it focused a lot on the conscious mind, on adapting. And some critics felt it became a bit barren, didn't really get into the deeper stuff, like selves and passionate desires. And Moskowitz suggests this was partly an attempt to de-ethnize psychoanalysis, to make it fit better for immigrants trying to assimilate in America, and he makes this connection. Desexualizing and de-ethnizing go hand in hand.
Interesting. Removing the messy, maybe othered parts?
Something like that. But this next point is crucial. Many of those early influential European analysts weren't just therapists, they were Marxists.
Really? Marxists?
Committed to social change.
Yeah.
People like Fennekel, Jacobson, the Reichs. They even set up clinics for the poor in places like Berlin. It really challenges that image of psychoanalysis as just for the wealthy elite.
That definitely changes the picture.
And Freud himself, while not a Marxist, was pretty critical of mainstream culture. He wrote that civilization is something imposed on a resisting majority by a minority.
Okay.
And he predicted that the underprivileged classes would envy the rich and develop intense hostility towards a culture they sustain but don't really share in the wealth of. He saw that tension.
So, pulling that thread together, psychoanalysis gets accused of being this mainstream, middle-class European thing.
Right.
But the paper argues its origins, its theory, they're actually quite different. More radical, more multicultural.
Exactly. The shift towards the mainstream later on. Partly economic self-interest, sure, but also, Moskowitz argues, internalized racism and fear.
Fear of what?
Fear that our ethnicity will be discovered along with our sexuality and the potentially revolutionary nature of our endeavor.
Yeah.
A kind of denial of its own edgy roots.
Okay, that's a lot to take in about psychoanalysis itself. Now let's shift to the second major theme, the reality of blackness.
Yes, and the paper is really clear. Any discussion here has to start by acknowledging the reality of pervasive and oppressive racism. That's the baseline.
It quotes a powerful description from Thompson about the constant awareness African Americans have of being black. And this detail is just staggering. For many black families, the first question isn't boy or girl, but what color is the child?
Which is really asking what place will your child have in this world? It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Thompson observed that for black patients, blackness permeates all aspects of their being.
And that's what trauma does, right? It permeates all aspects of being. The paper states very clearly, black people in this culture have been traumatized. Many by poverty and discrimination directly, but all by what it calls the daily narcissistic assault of living in a racist society.
That phrase, narcissistic assault, is powerful. It suggests an attack on one's very sense of self-worth.
Precisely. And how does that constant targeting affect identity? Well, Freud actually had his own taste of this.
You mentioned his father's story.
Yeah, when Freud was maybe 10 or 12, his father told him about a time a Christian guy knocked his new fur cap off into the mud, yelling "Jew" off the sidewalk.
Oh, wow. And what did his father do?
He just said, "I stepped into the road and picked up my cap."
How did young Freud react?
He was deeply disillusioned. It apparently fueled fantasies of revenge, identifying with figures like Hannibal, and made him realize he was part of a suppressed minority in opposition.
So he felt that sting, personally.
He did. But what's interesting is what Freud didn't really build into his formal theories.
Which was?
The paper points out he didn't fully conceptualize the terrible costs in narcissistic injury paid by those traumatized by oppression. Other analysts later talked about the self-hatred, the internalized racism felt by Jews in Freud's Vienna.
Right.
And there's this wild historical footnote, the modern nose job, invented by a Jewish surgeon in Berlin, 1898. Why? To efface the physical remnants of hated Jewishness.
That's quite something. It speaks volumes about internalized oppression.
It really does. And digging even deeper, historically, it's surprising to learn that as late as the mid-1800s in Europe, Jews were often described as black.
Curiously, black.
Yeah. Writers describe their African character, their faces, their features, as being like that of the black. It just shows how incredibly fluid and, frankly, arbitrary these categories have been.
It really undermines the idea of fixed racial groups.
Absolutely. Now, back to Freud. His sort of conquering hero persona definitely influenced early psychoanalysis. But the paper suggests his own unconscious stuff about his ethnicity, maybe even some self-hatred, also crept in.
How so?
Well, there's this tendency for victims to blame themselves.
Right, unfortunately, yes.
And some ways of interpreting psychoanalysis seem to echo that, suggesting that if you just own the reasons for your misery, you can escape it, kind of putting the onus back on the victim.
I see the problem there.
And Freud's idea about the universality of humankind's base nature. While maybe aiming for common ground, it also potentially aligned him with the ruling class, especially since Jews were often stereotyped as being too sexual and aggressive.
It's complicated.
Very. This connects, in a way, to Malcolm X and his use of X as his last name.
Right, replacing the slave master's name.
Exactly. He said it symbolized the true African family name that he never could know. It was a powerful act of reclaiming identity or acknowledging its theft, like Thompson said about blackness sometimes being defined by what it's not.
The X is so symbolic.
It really is. It represents opposition, negation, X is not, but also presence, X is also what is. It's the starting point, the place of buried treasure, absence and presence all at once.
A refusal and a declaration.
Beautifully put.
Okay, that's a heavy, important section. Now, let's tackle the most challenging claim head on. There is no ethnicity. How does Moskowitz even begin to argue that?
He uses an analogy from another psychoanalyst, Lacan. Lacan argued there's no sexual relation, meaning it's not some simple, universal thing, but hugely shaped by fantasy.
Okay.
Moskowitz applies that to ethnicity. It's less a hard fact, more a powerful collective fantasy. But here's the key. Calling it a fantasy doesn't make it less powerful.
Right. Fantasies can be incredibly powerful.
Exactly. But it does mean it's an idea. And fantasies are ideas, and ideas by their nature can change. It opens up possibilities for change through relationships, through talking about it.
So it's not denying the experience of ethnicity, but questioning its fundamental basis as a fixed thing.
Precisely. And it turns out other fields, like history and anthropology, also push back against turning concepts like culture or ethnicity into concrete objects.
Like the quote from Woolf.
Yeah, Woolf warned that concepts like nation, society, and culture name bits and threaten to turn names into things. He stressed that humanity is really a totality of interconnected processes. Everything's connected and flowing.
History certainly shows that fluidity, doesn't it? You mentioned Italians, Germans.
Right. People who were Tuscan or Sicilian became Italian, Prussians and Bavarians became German, and tragically, more recently, people who were Yugoslavs were violently split into Croats, Serbs, Bosnians.
That Yugoslav example is brutal.
It really is.
Yeah.
And think about it. The Bosnian Muslims, targeted by Serbs, they're Slavs too. They look similar, share customs. Their ancestors just converted to Islam centuries ago.
So the ethnic difference was largely religious in origin.
In that case, yes. And get this, 16% of Bosnian kids were from mixed marriages. It just highlights how these divisive ethnic lines were imposed by people wanting to exploit them.
It reveals how political these categories can be.
Totally. And look at the U.S. A sociologist, Alba, found back in 1990 that for most white Americans, ethnicity had become mainly symbolic, like a vestigial attachment, not costing much. 2/3 saw themselves as mixed ethnicity anyway.
So for many, it wasn't a defining daily reality.
Not in the same way. But then, Alba noted, something else emerged, maybe unconsciously, a new ethnic identity, European American.
Ah, and what defines that?
Well, according to the study, it has little real connection to the customs of Europe. Instead, it works by excluding people, Asians, Latinos, African Caribbeans, African Americans.
So it's an identity built on exclusion.
Essentially, yeah. An ethnicity of privilege and exclusion, defined by who's not in the club.
Okay, so connecting this back to psychoanalysis, the idea is we need to see ethnicity as this illusion of civilization.
Right. And ask what unconscious needs does it fill? The paper mentions a study group on anti-Semitism, concluding it stems from something deep, maybe universal, like basic stranger anxiety.
Fear of the unknown, the different.
Could be part of it. But if that potential for racism is universal, it's also nurtured by context and leadership. It needs fuel.
And it's hard to face our own negative potential.
Always. In Kleinian terms, reaching the depressive position, owning your own capacity for hatred and destruction, that's a struggle. It's always easier to see badness in others.
So projecting it outwards is easier.
Much easier. Owning our own dark side needs moral leadership, community support, and crucially, the potential for making meaningful reparations.
Which brings us to the paper's stark bottom line. Can you state it again?
There is no ethnicity. There is hatred and the need to deny our own badness and fear of our own hatred. Ethnicity and race are fantasies that we use to deny our own badness and displace it onto others, as well as to protect ourselves against the very real hatred that others may have for us.
That's a very direct and challenging statement. It basically reframes the whole issue.
It does, and it extends this to the delusion of black and white. That binary, the paper argues, is a delusion of civilization.
People aren't just black or white.
Yeah. Exactly. Where the line is drawn is politically and psychologically motivated.
Yeah.
And science backs this up. A geneticist is quoted saying there's no acceptable genetic basis for the concept of race.
Right.
And the fact that race is pretty much the only ethnic category in our culture that doesn't easily allow for dual identity, that just shows how rigid and, well, delusional the concept is.
It forces a choice where maybe none naturally exists.
Precisely. Now, Freud once said psychoanalysis is basically a cure through love, limited only by our inability to love or be loved.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, people have loved and married across all sorts of cultural boundaries throughout history, anthropologists, soldiers, everyone.
Love crosses those lines.
It does. And sometimes, the paper notes, therapy fails not because people are too different, but because of issues around sameness and betrayal within the relationship itself.
So what's the final call to action here, especially for psychoanalysis?
The paper argues that psychoanalysis, which was born in opposition and under oppression, kind of lost its way and became comfortably mainstream.
Partly economics, partly fear, as you said earlier.
Right. So the call is for it to return to those radical roots, to become a tool again for understanding oppression, how people are subjugated and how they internalize that.
Reclaiming its critical edge.
That's the idea.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored this idea that ethnicity as we know it might be a powerful, fluid, often unconscious fantasy.
Yeah, one that's shaped history, identity, even psychoanalysis itself.
And hopefully you, the listener, now have a different lens, maybe a more challenging one, to view identity, not as a fixed label.
But as this dynamic mix of history, personal experience, and these deep psychological forces, including that very human urge to project our own unwanted bits onto others.
So here's the final thought to leave you with. If ethnicity and race really are at their core, these societal fantasies we use to manage our own internal hatred and fear, what does really understanding that free you to do? Or maybe just see differently? How might it change how you engage with identity, your own and other people's, in your everyday life?